Okay, well, we've been set a very high mark with Celeste and Mel down in Sydney. I know you're excited to raise that bar once again, Maddie. We've got a bunch of questions here. I think we can cover a whole bunch of stuff and see where the conversation flows. So I want to go back to the beginning very quickly. You were 4 years old when you were diagnosed with transverse myelitis, which led to wheelchair use. Can you tell us how life was for you growing up in the Perth in the 90s?
You know what, I feel like this is such an interesting question because I think you expect the answer to be that life was very difficult or very different or that disability kind of shaped who I was as a person from a very young age, but it was the opposite. We talk a lot about disability and I guess the connection with trauma and them being very much one and the same. And we don't often separate the two into disability being a very neutral event or state of being and trauma being something that needs to be overcome, that incredible, challenging experience. And so when it came to my acquisition of disability, I was 4. I don't remember it. And, I remember my parents and my mum specifically being so adamant that I wouldn't experience the trauma of it at a young age. So I grew up having no understanding that the life that I was living, wasn't a typical one necessarily. And it wasn't until I was so much older where the social impact of disability started to really play a part in my life. But to begin with, all of that burden of trauma was carried by my parents.
So everything was fairly normal for you, I guess, as a kid. You knew your strengths, your superpowers, and gee, haven't you shown them over the last few years?
Thank you. It's been a wild. What was so funny is when I was a girl. Sydney Paralympics happened when I was maybe 7, I think. And so I grew up with Louise Savage being a household name for me. As as a young girl with a disability, I saw someone that looked like me on screens. And so I never knew any different. And I remember as a kid being stopped so often, my parents and I, and we'd be told like, she could be the next Paralympian, she could be the next Louise Savage. And I had no interest in sport at all as a kid. And so in a wild turn of events, I'm now coached by Louise Savage doing the exact job that she was doing. But it was definitely not the way we saw this going.
So at what stage did you get that interest in the sport and really starting to compete as well?
We had a really active family growing up. I'm one of 3 girls, and I'm in the middle. And again, I had no interest in sport as a kid, but I did want to do whatever my sisters were doing. And unfortunately for me, they were really good soccer players and really good netball players, which are arguably the 2 worst sports for a girl with a disability to try and play. So I remember being the world's worst goalkeeper, just hoping that my sisters were good enough soccer players that I would never have to see the ball. And thankfully they were great and it was fine, but it wasn't until I was 12 where you start to really notice the differences and, everyone's getting taller and faster and all those things. And I wasn't doing quite the same thing. And it was then that we started to explore wheelchair sports as an option. And I grew up in WA and our basketball program was centralised over there. A lot of our rollers and gliders are based over there. And I remember trying it out for like the 3rd or the 4th time. And I was so fucking bad at it. Apologies. It was terrible to the point that the man that coached it, a man named Frank Fonta, he was at the first ever Paralympic Games in Stoke Mandeville. He pulled me to the side, and I was 12, and he was like, "Look, you're just not really an asset to this team, are you?" And he had a track chair in the storage room of this basketball stadium, and I jumped in this race chair, and it was so big. We were putting foam either side of me to try and keep me in the middle, and I went around the parking lot in it, and I fell in love with it on the spot. And 2 years later, I made my first Paralympic team.
That's great, and you've definitely been an asset in many other areas since. So I'm going to jump forward a tiny bit now. You completed your first Paralympics in Beijing 2008 at the age of 14, everybody. It's mind-blowing. You won a silver medal as part of the 4x100 relay. Now, what does global success at such a young age do to the psyche there?
I think it does a couple of things. On the one hand, I think it encourages, pursuit of goals in a really positive way, in a really healthy, robust way. But I also think it encouraged a lot of hyperdependence and need to kind of, be my own person probably way too young. And on the other, I began to shape my entire identity around being successful and being an athlete, which was to my detriment. I went through 2 Paralympic Games, Beijing and then London, having absolutely no idea who I was. I was a 12-year-old and then a 14-year-old at my first Paralympic Games, surrounded by very successful athletes. And I thought that if I was going to be successful, I had to do what they were doing. And Celeste spoke about this earlier. It was my biggest downfall for the longest time, was trying to be someone that I wasn't. And when we picture athletes, we do think of a lot of very male qualities. They're very strong, very fierce, there's a lot of aggression and ego that's in it. And I didn't have any of that. And I thought that I had to become that in order to be successful. And it wasn't until I competed in London, and I remember coming away without a medal. When I think after having won one in Beijing, that was obviously a new experience for me. And I remember thinking I was going to retire. I was planning my very dramatic retirement at 18 years old. And I didn't think I had it in me to be an athlete. And I was trying so hard to be Louise Savage. And it was actually her, of all people, that pulled me aside. And she was like, "You're never going to be the next Louise Savage. You're going to be the first Madison de Rozario. Let's have a look at what that is." And I learned who I was as a person, and then I was able to learn who I was as an athlete, and it was a pivot point for me.
Sounds good. So I guess a little hint of that imposter syndrome early, but once you realise that you being your best self is the best way, it's the best way forward.
Absolutely. I definitely still have huge amounts of imposter syndrome, and I can't relate to what Celeste was saying before at all. I am absolutely riddled with it. But, I think it's one of those things that as women, I think we're notorious for doing, and it's a work in progress.
Well, I think you're progressing very well, and I'm going to progress through here. So you went on to compete at a total of 5 Paralympic Games. I'll get there. So far, that's an interesting one.
I was going to say, that was word like I'm retired. I haven't said that just yet.
I'm intrigued. Any hints on how long you'd like to go? Can we get to Brisbane?
You know what? I shouldn't say this publicly. My team is not going to be happy with me. I would love to. I'll be 38 in Brisbane when it comes around, which is a very reasonable retirement age for a marathon athlete. I've dropped a lot of events. I don't race on the track anymore. I'm just racing the marathon circuit at the moment. So it is a bit of a possibility. But we'll see. I'm not meant to be telling anyone that
would be
yet.
very exciting to see you racing right here in just a few years' time.
Thank you.
Fingers crossed that will work out. Now, you were flag bearer at last year's Games in Paris. Can you talk us through that experience? It seems mind-blowing.
Oh, surreal. It's still one of those ones you kind of think back on the memories of it and you're like, are these my memories? Because there's no way that I was out there doing that. And, I think it's so interesting. The racing for Australia, the Australian flag it plays this sort of huge, I guess, like, as far as imagery goes, like role in who I am as a person. And I remember, pulling on my first Australian uniform and you've got the little flag, on your chest. And I remember in Beijing walking into the bird's nest and following our flag bearer, and you just like see this lofty Australian flag, at the front of that, group of people walking in. And I remember when we walked in the bird's nest, there was 400 of us. Someone started singing Waltzing Matilda, and it's just one of the most core memories that I have is walking into this stadium that I was going to race in, surrounded by a team of people all wearing the green and gold with that Australian flag. And I remember what that felt like as a 14-year-old. And I remember who I went into those games as and who I came out of them as and who I then got to become. And so I think to get to carry that flag in Paris was one of the most surreal experiences of my life.
It's giving me shivers down my spine, and I'm just hearing about it. So it must have been an amazing experience.
And to get to share it with Brendan Hall carried it with me, and I was 14 in Beijing and he was 15, and it was both of our first games. We both never went to an opening ceremony since, so we did Beijing and then we did Paris together. And I remember in Tokyo, before the games start, I hadn't won a gold medal yet, and I was approached for different leadership roles in the team, and I remember turning them down because I didn't think I had what it took. I was going into those games as such a selfish athlete because that's who I thought and I think knew I needed to be to win, that very elusive gold medal for me at that point. And I remember the relief of it being done, and when those opportunities presented in Paris, just the different mindset I was in to be able to accept them and to get to be a part of a team and to give back in the ways that so many people gave to me throughout my career. So it was quite a full circle moment for me.
Bit of a change in mindset over time there. Now, you've alluded to this before, but many moments in your life have required resilience and grit, but of course everything doesn't quite go to plan. Do you have a lesson about failure that you can share?
I think that success just looks like failure. We just pick out the highlight reel a little bit. If I had to if we're playing pure numbers here, I have lost way more races than I have ever won in my life.
We can forget about those ones, can't we?
Right, but and we do, and so we can say that I have had a successful career as an athlete. But the reality is, I've just failed so many times, and I've gotten it right a couple of times, and luckily at the right times. And I think we talk about failure quite a lot as far as, we don't want someone to be defined by it. We tell ourselves, we tell our friends, we tell our families, we tell students that we aren't defined by our failures. And I think in equal measures, we need to not be defined by our successes. And I don't think I realized this until I became successful and I began to win races. And sport is very black and white. There's no two ways about it. If you cross that finish line first, you are successful, and that's the end of it, which makes it a very easy, I guess, concept to wrap your head around. And I remember waking up the next morning after my first world title and realizing that nothing had changed. That I was the exact same person as I had been before I'd done it. The same people, that were in my corner beforehand were still there. And I think we tell ourselves that there is this elusive goal of success, and when we achieve it, we'll be better and more worthy of love or respect or whatever it is. But I think success and failure kind of both exist in this almost identical parts of the spectrum where neither of them are really important. I'm so proud of everything I've achieved as an athlete, and every time I do see that gold medal from Tokyo, it's a bit of a pinch me moment, and it's amazing. But it mostly just resembles, to me, it's the person that I had to become in order to do it. And that doesn't go anywhere. I could retire today. I could never win a gold medal again. And I still had to become someone that was worthy of being proud of in order to do that. And so I think success and failure just look the exact same end of the day.
And it's interesting you noted that you weren't a different person after the success. And I perhaps hurriedly said we can forget about the failure, but maybe is it something that you can draw on it and then move forward instead of maybe just pushing it down? I guess some of the losses you might have to move on from, but can you learn a bit from that process as you go?
Yeah, you can. And we do this thing as a team, as my performance team and I, is after every race, no matter where in the world I am, we jump on a 15-minute phone call and we just kind of go through the race very quickly, and then we're done and we move on. And it was quite shocking to me. We'd done it a few times after some bad races. We first implemented this in a low point in my racing career. And I remember winning London Marathon, and we had an identical phone call. At the beginning, there was like, congrats, that was great. And they were like, what did you do wrong? What can we do better? What was really great? So it was exactly the same, and it's very humbling. It's a very grounding experience to view it that way.
I guess that's the good thing, that the highs aren't as high and the lows aren't as low as well. So you get that bit of grounding in between everything.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to move on. You're not just a champion on the track. You're a powerful advocate for disability representation. What's the biggest misconception people have about athletes with disabilities?
Oh, I think about people with disabilities, or about disability in general, I guess, as a concept almost outside of the person. I think we want to view disability so badly as negative, as opposed to a neutral. And I think when we talk about this, when I say not a negative, I think we jump to it being a positive. And we kind of view disability in two ways. One as a very negative thing that we're fearful of. There's a lot of discomfort around disability. We know that we don't want to be in that position necessarily. Or we kind of view it in this, this hero light, where someone has overcome their disability to become a better person because of it. But even in that narrative, the disability itself still has to be a negative thing. If it's something to be overcome, that was the challenge, then it in itself is negative. When disability is neutral, it's a starting point. It's how I'm turning up here today. It's neither good nor bad. It's just who I am. And when we kind of view it through that lens, we're able to progress in how we view a person by seeing them through a very multifaceted lens, and we're able to see them as who they are as a person, and rather than getting caught on this very strong identifier that carries a lot of stigma with it, and a lot of negative stigma.
And we just heard Celeste Barber talking about being maybe downplayed by doctors with ADHD, and then realising, no, that's actually her superpower. So I guess it's a bit of a mindset and finding what your strengths are as well.
100%. And I think that was probably one of the biggest challenges is, I said earlier that I grew up without really acknowledging my disability, and then I did a full 180 on that when I was about 14, when it's all anyone notices in you. And so as a result of us all being very much shaped by our society, you begin to internalize that. And, I very much did that, and I hated the body that I was in. And I think, as young girls growing up, we're all told to hate the body we're in anyway, and then you add disability onto that. That was an enormous challenge, and it took so much unlearning to kind of reach a point of like genuine neutrality about it. And, you know, I never, you hear a lot of people say they feel very lucky to have a disability. I don't feel that because it goes against my let's be neutral about it. But I do know that I wouldn't have learned a lot of the things that I did. I think I was able to make peace with all the issues I had around body image and hating how I was physically turning up and, you know, all those things if I didn't have a choice. You know, I think when we look at our bodies and we say, I want to lose weight or I want to be stronger or I want to be all these things, that they're kind of a little bit attainable. And so we sort of tell ourselves that when I do that, I'll be better, I'll be perceived better. When you're a young girl in a wheelchair, you look at that and you go, that's just not going anywhere. And you're kind of put in a position where you have to make peace with it or you're never going to. And so I think as a result of that, I was able to kind of be able to view it very neutrally. And you add sport into that, you know, the qualities that we demand of young women and young people with disabilities go against everything that we demand of athletes. You know, we tell, you know, young girls to be quiet and to be polite and to be small, and we tell people with disabilities that your body isn't good for activity, it's not strong and it's not capable. And then as an athlete, you have to be strong and you have to take up space and you have to trust yourself and take a chance on yourself, and trying to make those three realities work was very difficult. And so I think I used sport to kind of come to terms with who I was as a person, but it was a very long journey.
Would you have any hints for anyone that doesn't have sport as an outlet to make that change in mindset?
I think that sport, your body shouldn't have to do anything for you in order to be valid and beautiful and worthy of love and respect. I think if all your body does is provide a home for you, then that is more than enough. And I think we often ask more of it than that, but realistically, that's all she's there for.
Absolutely. Now I'm going to change pace a little bit now. This is a pretty good brag right here. Australia's produced some absolutely legendary wheelchair athletes, Kurt Fearnley, Dylan Alcott, Louise Savage, as we've heard. Have any of those also had their very own Barbie doll? And can you tell us about this story? It's pretty fascinating.
This is still also a bit surreal. I remember getting this phone call and they were so cryptic because Mattel doesn't tell you they're making you into a Barbie doll until you sign the NDA and you sign all the paperwork. I remember getting this phone call and it was my manager at the time, and he was like, this brand's reached out, you have to sign it. That's kind of the end of the conversation. I remember being so, they're like, you definitely know the brand, you definitely want to do this, but you just have to trust us. And it was so nerve-wracking. And I remember signing it and then finding out what it was. And it was unreal because I think to have a woman with a disability being how we thought sport, being the person who embodied sport in Australia at that time in 2018 wasn't something that I ever thought, you know, would happen. I remember growing up as an athlete and you see so many incredible women athletes and none of them really look like you too much. And so I remember seeing, you know, realizing what was happening and it just being absolutely unbelievable. And other than it being just ridiculously cool, it was, there's not very many moments, I think, where you get to work with a huge brand whose platform aligns so well with yours. And I think, you know, we can, as athletes, as women, we can believe all the things that we believe and we can say them, but we don't always have the audiences. And so I think to be given a platform and to be given it by a brand who wanted to amplify what I was saying and not kind of change it to suit their own messaging or brand it was my first time ever experiencing that. And I remember being able to grab onto that experience and demand it every single time going forward.
And now you have one that looks exactly like you and a lot more similar to a lot more people out there as well. So
100%.
That's a great step. If they make a Barbie movie too, any chances of a bit of casting?
Oh my God, I just want a little wheelchair racer. I think that'd be sick.
Fingers crossed, we can hope. Now I'm going to restrict you here. Accessibility in sport media and everyday life is improving, but there's still a lot of work to do. If you could change one thing, I'm going to give you one thing overnight, what would it be?
Visibility over representation, I think. So representation is often, I guess, the stepping stone towards genuine, authentic visibility. And right now, I think with women and with people with disabilities, we're very much in that representation phase in lots of places still, not all of them, but in a lot of them. So for example, like if I'm scrolling on social media with the volume off and I see a person with a disability come up in a video, I know for a fact that video, if I turn the sound on, is going to be about disability. And it's great that it's on my feed. It's great that I'm seeing disability, but their role, their identity is to be disabled in that moment. And what that kind of tells 20% of Australia who live with a disability is that their identity is this thing that, again, has a lot of negative stigma associated with it. And it tells the 80% of Australia that that is their identity. And seeing genuine, authentic visibility is if you're doing that same scroll, you turn the volume on and they're talking about anything else, employment, the arts, fashion, whatever it may be. And if we picture that, we'd all be a little bit shocked if we turned the sound on and that's what was happening on our screens. But that's visibility. And I think if overnight, if we could shift to that, I think it would make an enormous change.
So it's just being people with normal trials and tribulations.
Exactly.
It's a great mindset. And so succinctly put as well. I was expecting a little bit more thought, but I think you were ready for that one. It was great. Okay, one more thing, and I'll leave you in peace to enjoy the rest of the day. And what's one way we can all be better allies for people with disabilities?
One of the things that I've learned as a person with a disability and also as a woman is that we're having the exact same conversation. And obviously there's been a far more conversation around intersectionality recently. And this idea of overlap. And what we're not doing very well, though, is moving everyone together. And if we look at the disability movement, we're kind of just 20 years behind the women's movement. And I didn't realize this until I was trying to find language to describe the experience of having a disability and finding that I was just pulling language from the feminist movement, things that I would, hear women saying. I was like, this applies to me as well, but not in the way that I thought it would, that it was intended. And so when we have those conversations, we need to bring every single person with us. And I know that we do say that, but it feels like a difficult challenge to do. I think, a lot of people in this room, in any room, won't have a ton of knowledge around disability. And as we touched on earlier, there is so much discomfort around it. So the thought of even having that conversation, on behalf of someone with a disability who isn't in that room is really, it's terrifying. Like that thought isn't one that many of us are willing to engage with. But the reality is you're going to have a much more sound of disability than I think any of you realize. I think anyone who's experienced girlhood, who's experienced womanhood, who's experienced oppression and lack of privilege, it's all the exact same conversation that we're having. And I think bringing everyone into the room when we're not in it, I think is so powerful. And the example that is incredible for this is, during the Tokyo Paralympics, there was an announcement that kind of, it went public that Olympians were receiving a medal bonus and Paralympians weren't. And a huge part of this was an enormous miscommunication. We don't belong to the Olympic Committee, which is where that money was coming from. And there was no inequality actually happening by any one organisation. But as Paralympians, it's the one time in 4 years where we're all really busy and we don't have the time to have that conversation and take advantage of the fact that there's this massive public movement supporting us all of a sudden. And it was women in sport that did it for us. So I don't know if you guys follow the Female Athlete Project. I know Chloe Dalton, she took it upon herself to use her platform as a woman, a non-disabled woman who understood the experience of a disabled person through being a woman and those experiences, and ran with it. And it was so powerful. And that's what got us across the line was this woman athlete who saw the similarities to what we were experiencing at the time and knew our hands were tied. And I think anyone can do that. And that was so incredibly powerful.
And hopefully we can start to bridge that 20-year gap and the gap with everyone as well very soon. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Madison de Rozario, sorry. Some great words there, and I really, really enjoyed that chat. I think we gave Celeste and Mel a little run for their money there.
Thank you.
Thank you.